prom was supposed to be her loneliest night, until her father, missing in action for years, showed up with a corsage in hand. She had no idea that dancing with him would be the easy part. The real shocker landed in the mailbox at sunrise, leaving her speechless and forever changed. No one could have predicted how quietly a broken heart could echo through an entire funeral hall. The sharp scent of white roses cut through the cold air, mingling with the hushed sobs of distant relatives. Only the frail light from the windows spared the room from total darkness, though it did nothing to warm the tension hovering over the casket. Some stood at the back, whispering rumors about the deceased. Others dabbed at their eyes, uncertain whether they were mourning Daisy herself or the tragedy she had left behind. Molly, dressed in a simple black dress that hung loose around her small frame, sat motionless in the front row. Her gaze was locked on the closed coffin. If one dared to look closer, they would see that her eyes, though dry, reflected an otherworldly hollowness. She had spent the past few days swinging between numb disbelief and agonizing grief. The unstoppable whirlwind of funeral preparations barely gave her a chance to catch her breath, let alone process what had happened. In the buzz of sympathetic murmurs, she recalled fleeting memories of her mother, Daisy's gentle laughter echoing through a cramped living room, the smell of freshly baked bread on winter nights, and the whispered words Molly could never quite shake. "He never cared about you. Remember that, Molly." These words once seemed like a shield Daisy carried, a stubborn fact about Molly's father that no one was allowed to dispute. Now, at the very moment Molly needed family most, Daisy was gone, and that shield was gone too. All that remained was an empty seat beside her. The service dragged on with polite formalities, but Molly hardly listened. Everything blurred into static. Finally, the minister signaled the end. People began trickling out with quiet condolences. That's when the heavy wooden door at the back of the room groaned open, pulling the mourner's attention away from the casket. A tall figure slipped inside, late, uncertain, and to Molly's disbelief, strangely familiar. With a heart thudding like thunder in her ears, Molly realized she was staring at him. Dany, her father, the man whose only contributions in her life, as far as she knew, were the monthly child support checks and the scornful mentions from her mother. She felt something twist inside her. Rage, perhaps, but also a spark of hope she couldn't explain. Why was he here now, lurking in the final minutes of a funeral he had every reason to attend from the start? Was it guilt? Or maybe, she dared to wonder, something else? Molly's eyes narrowed, and the shape of her own reflection on the coffin lid seemed to mock her. Would he even speak to her? Did she want him to? While she silently wrestled with those thoughts, Dany took a hesitant step forward, gaze shifting from the wreaths of white roses to Molly herself. There was a prickling tension between them, almost like static electricity. Anger flared at the edges of Molly's mind. She remembered Daisy's bitter warnings. Yet, beneath that anger lay a tiny pulse of curiosity. She hated that it was there at all, but for better or worse, she couldn't deny it. With tears she refused to shed, she turned away. If Dany wanted to say something, he would have to make the first move. In the days that followed, Molly discovered that her mother's will held an unexpected instruction. Molly was to live with Dany. The words might as well have been carved into stone, as there was no contesting the legalities. One morning, an austere-looking social worker showed up at Molly's door with a stack of paperwork and a tone that suggested there was no use arguing. Before she knew it, Molly found herself packing the few belongings she had into worn-out suitcases, swallowing the bitter taste of disbelief. The first time Molly stepped into Dany's house, she felt as though she'd trespassed into a stranger's secret hideout. The place was small but oddly neat, like someone who cleaned often yet never truly lived there. She noticed a couple of framed photographs on the shelf. Dany shaking hands with colleagues, Dany with a company plaque in front of a drab office building. Pictures of a life that had nothing to do with Molly. There were no baby photos of her, no souvenirs that echoed her childhood. It was as if she'd stepped into a story that had begun years before she arrived, but every chapter until now had left her out of the narrative. Though she wouldn't admit it, a pang of sadness crossed her mind. Daisy's warnings about Dany had always been grim. He was a man who loved his freedom more than responsibility, a man who would sooner disappear than be a supportive father. Yet, he was the only parent she had left. As Molly trudged from room to room, she noted the emptiness of the walls, the lack of color. It sent a chill through her. Could she really call this place home? But there was no turning back. The legal documents dictated her path. At least for now, her life would be entwined with Dany's, a father she barely knew, in a house that felt too large and too hollow all at once. Late at night, she would lie awake, staring at a plain white ceiling, wondering if her mother had set this up intentionally. And if so, what was Daisy trying to prove? In the following weeks, Molly began to notice tiny cracks in the stoic exterior of her father's world. Sure, he was stiff, and yes, he sometimes looked painfully unsure of what to say to a teenage daughter who all but despised him. But he was trying, almost too hard. She would wake up to the sound of pots and pans clattering in the kitchen, followed by a sheepish apology wafting through the hallway. The first time she dared to step in, she found Dany desperately scraping burnt pancake batter off a frying pan. Flour dust lingered in the air like a miniature snowstorm, and the acrid smell of char filled her nostrils. "Sorry," he muttered, half embarrassed, half amused at his own failure. "I thought you might like breakfast before school." Molly, unsure how to respond, nodded stiffly. Her heart tightened. She'd never seen him like this, vulnerable, almost bashful. It felt wrong to see him as anything other than the distant figure Daisy had painted. Other small signs emerged. Once, she caught him hunched over his phone, watching a tutorial on how to braid hair. Another time, he tried to help her with algebra homework, only to end up scratching his head in frustration. If Molly had been in a different mood, she might have laughed. But she kept her distance, refusing to let down her guard completely. Every night, she locked herself in the small bedroom she'd been given. The door was a silent barrier, protecting her from the swirling uncertainty in her heart. Yet with each awkward gesture, each burned pancake, each clumsy attempt to chat about her day, Molly began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, her mother's portrait of Dany hadn't been the full story. Could there be a side of him Molly had never been allowed to see? She pushed that thought away, telling herself not to get lured into false hope. After all, people didn't just change overnight. And yet, a single question nagged at her. Why is he doing all this now? She had no idea that the answer, which she half feared and half anticipated, would upend everything she believed about him and about herself in the days to come. Molly could sense it the moment she walked into homeroom. Prom fever was in full swing. Everywhere she turned, clusters of classmates huddled together, voices crackling with anticipation. She overheard bits of conversation about the perfect dress, the perfect date, the perfect after-party. Everyone seemed determined to craft an unforgettable night. Yet, amid the whirlwind of excitement, Molly felt like a silent observer trapped on the outside. She kept her head down, hoping to glide through the day unnoticed. But that strategy rarely worked. During lunch, she found herself seated at a table adjacent to a particularly boisterous group. "Who do you think will ask Jade? She's got, like, 5 guys lined up already?" A girl chattered, her eyes gleaming with envy. "I heard Mark's going with Ava. They're gonna match in royal blue. So cute." Another friend chimed in. Molly picked at the edges of her notebook, pretending to be deeply fascinated by a doodle on the cover. She wished she could tune out every syllable. It was impossible, though, especially when she heard her own name. "Hey, do you think anyone's gonna ask Molly?" One girl whispered, not so quietly. "I doubt it." A boy snorted. "I'd rather go alone than be stuck with her all night." A little shock wave rippled through Molly's chest, but she resisted the urge to react. Her fingers tightened around the binding of her notebook. She told herself she didn't care. Why should she? Prom was just a dumb event, a swirling haze of glitter and music. But try as she might to brush it off, their words stung. They confirmed what she'd feared all along, that she was invisible or, worse, an inconvenience. In the hallway later, people breezed past with arms full of flyers about ticket sales and photo packages. Molly found herself suffocating in the crowd, trapped by the knowledge that she was the only one with no plan. No date, no dress. The noise of laughter echoed in her ears, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if it might have been better never to set foot in school again until prom was all over. She tried to focus on anything else: her biology assignment, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, the ticking of the clock overhead. But her thoughts kept circling back to that single humiliating truth. No one had asked her, and no one would. With each passing period, the weight in her chest grew heavier, choking her attempts to breathe easily. By the last bell, she felt utterly drained, barely able to muster the energy to walk home. When Molly finally reached home, she was met not by the quiet refuge she had hoped for, but by an empty living room and a scribbled note on the kitchen table. The words were scrawled in Dany's uneven handwriting. "Went out for a bit. Be back soon. Dad." A wave of bitter cynicism crashed over her. He was probably at some bar, she thought, nursing a drink instead of being here, where a real father might have asked her about her day or sensed the sadness simmering beneath her surface. That old resentment ignited inside her, a flicker of frustration that swiftly turned into a roaring blaze. Tossing the note aside, Molly dragged herself into her bedroom. Shutting the door, she flipped open her laptop and scrolled through social media. It was as though the universe had conspired to taunt her. Every post featured a friend or classmate showing off a new prom dress or boasting about an elaborate proposal. Her feed looked like a parade of happiness she couldn't participate in. She felt an unsettling tightness in her throat. Daisy's words echoed in her mind. Accusations about Dany's unreliability, warnings that he would always put himself first. Molly wanted to be strong, to shrug it off, to remind herself that she barely cared about prom to begin with. But her defenses were crumbling under the pressure of loneliness. That night, she let exhaustion overtake her earlier than usual. Slipping into a restless sleep, she sank into a dream where the gym was transformed into a sparkling prom wonderland. Everyone around her was dancing, couples spinning gracefully under twinkling lights. But Molly stood paralyzed in the center, no partner to hold, no hand to guide her. Faces blurred into smudges of laughter and pointed stares, and the music grew distant, fading into an echo. She awoke before dawn, clutching her bedsheets with trembling fingers. The loneliness felt magnified in the darkness. For a split second, she wondered if Dany had returned at all. But the thought of checking on him, on a father who seemed more absent than present, felt like more effort than she could manage. Instead, she curled up under the blankets, silently wishing she could slip away from all of it. The relentless buzz about prom, the judging glances at school, and the uncertain promise of a father she wasn't sure she could trust. Sunlight peeked through Molly's curtains the next morning, greeting her with a warmth that felt at odds with her sour mood. She considered feigning illness to avoid school, but she knew that would only postpone the inevitable. With a resigned sigh, she dressed and stepped into the hallway, determined to dash out of the house without any awkward run-ins. But fate had a different plan. The moment she cracked open her bedroom door, she spotted a figure standing near the entrance. It was Dany, though he looked almost unrecognizable. Gone were the rumpled jeans and worn t-shirt. Instead, he was dressed in a neatly pressed suit, complete with a modest but elegant tie. In his hand, he held something she couldn't immediately identify. Small, delicate, and wrapped with a ribbon. Molly froze. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as a million questions surged through her mind. Why was he dressed like that? What was he holding? Had something happened? As if sensing her presence, Dany turned around. His usually guarded expression cracked into a tentative smile, a mix of nerves and excitement. He cleared his throat, as though steeling himself for a monumental confession. "Morning, Molly," he began, voice quavering slightly. I know this might sound odd, but I was thinking about how important prom is. At least, I think it's important. And I realized something." Molly's eyes flicked to the object in his hand. She recognized it now. A corsage, a simple but lovely wrist flower arrangement. "I know I can't replace anyone you might have wanted to go with," he continued, each word teetering on uncertainty. "But would you consider going to prom with me?" A dull roar filled Molly's mind. She couldn't speak at first, couldn't even breathe. The corsage, the suit, the nervousness in his eyes. None of it computed with the image she'd held onto for so long, the image of a man who didn't care. "I don't know," she stammered, blinking back a sudden rush of tears. Dany stepped closer, still holding out the corsage as if it were a peace offering. "I've been trying to figure out how to be the dad you deserve," he admitted softly. "This might be too little, too late, but I just wanted to show you that you matter. And if nobody else has asked, maybe we could share this moment together." Molly's heart twisted. Tears spilled down her cheeks, betraying the wall she'd fought so hard to maintain. Somewhere in the whirlwind of emotions, relief, gratitude, disbelief, she managed a nod. She reached out to touch the corsage, her fingers trembling against the soft petals. "Okay," she whispered, voice breaking. "I'll go with you." In that instant, an unspoken weight lifted between them. For the first time since Daisy's funeral, Molly found herself gazing at Dany not with skepticism or anger, but with a newfound sense of possibility, one that would soon transform her life in ways she never imagined. The evening sky was streaked with shades of gold and pink as Molly stepped out of the car, heart pounding against her ribcage. In her wildest dreams, she'd never pictured arriving at prom on her father's arm, especially not a father she'd once believed couldn't care less about her existence. Yet here she was, her hand gently clasped around Dany's elbow, feeling as though she'd landed in some parallel universe. The venue, a transformed school gym, glistened like a secret wonderland. Strands of fairy lights draped across the rafters, casting a soft glow on clusters of balloons and twirling silhouettes of students. The pulsing beat of the music mingled with the buzz of chatter and laughter. It should have been exhilarating, but the second Molly and Dany entered, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of conversation quieted, if only for a few seconds, and dozens of curious eyes swung their way. Molly froze. Her stomach knotted with fear. A part of her wanted to turn around and leave, to spare herself the inevitable gawking. But Dany, looking more determined than ever, gave her a reassuring nod. Without a word, he guided her forward, navigating past stunned classmates who parted like waves around them. At first, the whispers were unmistakably sharp. "Is that Molly's dad? What's he doing here? Oh my gosh, he actually came with her. That's weird, right?" Her cheeks flamed under their stares, but she forced herself to keep her head high. A few steps deeper into the gym, something surprising happened. The music's tempo dropped, melting into a languid, dreamy tune. Whether it was a coincidence or a deliberate gesture by the DJ, Molly couldn't be sure. But it was enough to draw everyone's attention away from their entrance and back to the dance floor. Dany pulled out a chair for Molly at an empty table near the corner, away from the immediate spotlight. She lowered herself gingerly, still feeling every eye in the room, but trying not to flinch beneath the scrutiny. Her father flashed a soft smile, an unspoken message of encouragement, and then sat beside her. For several agonizing moments, no one approached. A few teachers eyed them sympathetically, and some students, mainly those who'd caught a glimpse of Molly's vulnerability, looked uncertain, as if re-evaluating their initial judgments. Eventually, a teacher Molly recognized from her English class walked over with a warm greeting. "I'm so glad you made it, Molly," she said softly, her eyes flicking to Dany. "And you must be her father. I believe I've seen you around once or twice. Welcome." Dany stood, extending his hand in a polite, almost shy gesture. After the teacher drifted away, he turned back to Molly. The tension between them felt tangible, like a thin glass wall they weren't quite sure how to break. When the first notes of a slow dance began, a classic ballad that Molly vaguely recognized, Dany inhaled deeply and stood up. He extended his hand in a gesture that felt both hesitant and brave. "I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted, voice hushed, "but I think you deserve at least one special dance tonight." Molly hesitated, her heart pounding even harder. She could practically feel the weight of the entire gym's gaze on her back. But as she looked into Dany's eyes, genuine, earnest, and tinted with regret, she found the courage to nod. Slipping her hand into his, she allowed him to guide her onto the dance floor. At first, it was awkward. Their steps didn't quite align, and Dany's shoulders were tense, as if bracing for ridicule. But somewhere along the way, their movements found a tentative rhythm. Slowly, Molly relaxed, listening to the lyrics that spoke of hope and second chances. She rested her cheek against his chest, and for a blissful few seconds, she forgot about the stares, the rumors, and the lingering distrust. She remembered only that she was dancing with her father, and it felt oddly right. A hush fell over the crowd, as if acknowledging an unspoken shift. Molly could sense their reactions, a mixture of curiosity, surprise, and possibly admiration. In the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of a few classmates blinking back tears, and a group of seniors whispering how they never realized Molly's dad actually cared. The air was charged, but not in a mocking way. It was reverent, almost tender. At the edge of the dance floor, an older teacher, gray-haired and slightly hunched, leaned toward another chaperone, voice trembling with emotion. "Now that's what real love looks like," he murmured, never taking his eyes off the father-daughter duo. The rest of the prom played out like an unexpected dream. Molly and Dany lingered at their table, exchanging the first real conversation they'd had in years. She found herself laughing at his stories of youthful mischief, tales she never knew existed. And every so often, another teacher or a bold student would approach to say hi, offering a smile that suggested they were moved by what they'd seen. By the time the final song ended, the tension in Molly's chest had eased into a warm glow. She was still Molly, the girl with insecurities and heartbreak, but something fundamental had shifted. Perhaps it was the realization that Dany cared enough to step into her world, risking ridicule or worse. Or maybe it was that in one magical night, she felt less alone than she had all year. As the lights brightened and the crowd dispersed, Molly and Dany walked out hand in hand. The once pink horizon was now a deep midnight blue, studded with stars. Each step toward the car felt like a chapter closing on bitterness and opening to the possibility of reconciliation. When she slid into the passenger seat, Molly realized she wasn't just leaving prom. She was leaving a piece of her old self behind. The next day dawned with a tranquility that felt almost surreal. Sunbeams slipped through the window blinds, illuminating Molly's bedroom in gentle stripes of light. She woke with remnants of the previous night's music swirling in her mind, the memory of Dany's awkward yet heartfelt dance stirring something tender in her chest. Outside, birds were chirping in a mellow chorus as Molly made her way to the kitchen. She half expected to find Dany already there, attempting another ill-fated breakfast. Instead, she was greeted by silence. A single note on the counter read, "Want to check the mail? Be right back." A small smile tugged at her lips. She'd never realized how quickly she would come to appreciate those little notes. Pouring herself a glass of orange juice, she felt a ripple of calm wash over her. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. Moments later, she heard the front door creak open. Dany walked in, a plain white envelope in his hand. His face looked perplexed, almost shell-shocked, as though he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "Molly," he said quietly, turning the envelope over in his fingers. "Do you know anyone named Linda Walton?" Molly shook her head, setting her juice down with a slight frown. "No, never heard of her." "Why?" Dany didn't reply. He carefully tore open the envelope, pulling out a folded letter. As he began to read, his expression wavered between disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Sensing the shift, Molly stepped closer, peering up at him anxiously. "What is it?" she pressed gently. Dany cleared his throat and began reading the letter aloud, voice trembling. "Dear Mr. Walker, I was chaperoning the prom last night and witnessed a moment I won't forget anytime soon. In a world where so many fathers seem to have forgotten what it means to truly be there for their children, you reminded me, and many others, of the profound beauty of a parent's love. Watching you dance with Molly, seeing the look on both of your faces, it touched my heart. It was like witnessing something pure, a reminder of how meaningful such a bond can be. I spoke to several other parents who felt the same way. We wanted to do something, however small, to show our support for families like yours. Please accept this gift. It isn't a solution to every problem, but we hope it can help you continue to be the father your daughter needs. Sincerely, Linda Walton." On behalf of a few very grateful parents. With a quivering hand, Dany pulled a rectangular piece of paper from the envelope. Molly's eyes immediately caught the figure scrawled in bold print, $10,000. A soft gasp escaped her lips. "It's a check?" Dany whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. 10,000, from complete strangers. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. Molly stared at the check, her mind swirling. She pictured the swirl of prom lights, the hush that fell when she and Dany danced. She recalled the older teacher's words, whispered reverently. "That's what real love looks like." A flood of emotions tore through her, gratitude, disbelief, a sudden warmth she couldn't quite name. Before she realized it, tears blurred her vision. She quickly wiped them away, but it was too late. Dany saw, and for once, he didn't hold back either. His eyes brimmed with the tears he'd tried so long to hide, and in that moment, any remaining barrier between them seemed to dissolve. He exhaled shakily, gazing at his daughter with a mix of awe and humility. We can use this for your surgery?" he murmured, recalling the long table discussions about Molly's procedure, one that could significantly improve her mobility and well-being. "I've been working 2 jobs to save up, but this changes everything." Molly couldn't speak. The lump in her throat made it impossible to form words. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her father. Hesitation had once ruled their relationship, but right now, neither was afraid to show how much they needed the other. The check trembled in Dany's grasp as he returned her embrace. Outside, the sunlight streamed through the living room curtains, as though blessing the scene with quiet wonder. The hush of the house felt reverent, like a sacred vow unspoken yet deeply understood. In that moment, both Molly and Dany realized something monumental. Last night hadn't just been a dance at prom. It was a turning point. One small act of vulnerability had rippled outward, touching the hearts of people they never even knew. And in the space of a single morning, their entire future looked a little brighter, a little more hopeful. They held each other for a long time. No words necessary. A new chapter had begun, one filled with second chances and unbreakable bonds. And for the first time since Daisy's funeral, Molly felt a certainty blossoming in her heart. She wasn't alone anymore. In the days leading up to Molly's surgery, a quiet kind of anticipation settled over the house. The check from Linda Walton and the other parents had allowed them to schedule the procedure far sooner than they ever imagined. For Molly, it felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge stretched over an impossible chasm. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and she feared she might tumble back into the darkness of hopelessness. When the day finally arrived, Molly sat in the hospital waiting room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The antiseptic smell made her stomach churn, and 100 worst-case scenarios coursed through her mind. Yet, she gripped Dany's hand as though it were a lifeline. In that moment, the memory of prom, of his gentle voice reassuring her, came back in vivid detail. Somehow, it bolstered her courage. "You're going to be fine," Dany whispered, his gaze never leaving her face. "And I'm not going anywhere." The operating room felt surreal, cold, bright, and filled with the mechanical hum of medical equipment. Molly tried to steady her breathing as she was wheeled in, the overhead lights a stark white blur. Before the anesthesia took hold, she managed one final glance at Dany standing by the doors, giving her a shaky thumbs up. It was enough to anchor her, at least for that fleeting instant. The surgery itself was a haze. When Molly finally came to, she felt more exhausted than she'd ever been in her life. Pain rippled through her body in relentless waves, each pulse a reminder of the massive hurdle she'd just leaped. But she also felt something else, relief. The doctors informed her that the operation had gone smoothly, though the road to recovery would be steep. And it was. The following weeks were a blur of physical therapy sessions and restless nights. Every morning felt like starting from scratch, her muscles protesting the smallest movements, her balance thrown off by the newness of her condition. Countless times, she found herself on the verge of tears as she tried and failed to make her legs do what she wanted them to do. Through it all, Dany was there. He slept in a chair by her hospital bed for days, refusing to leave her side. He learned how to help strap her into various machines, how to hand her water and medication with a gentleness Molly had never expected from him. Even the hospital staff began to notice his unwavering presence. One nurse even joked that he ought to be on the payroll for the hours he put in. When Molly finally returned home, the routine of recovery intensified. Her life revolved around scheduled exercises, doctor's checkups, and the slow, painstaking process of retraining her body. Though she never voiced it out loud, she often felt moments of despair as she collapsed on the living room floor, sweat trickling down her forehead. Was she really getting stronger, or just trading one limitation for another? During one particularly grueling session, Molly felt an overpowering urge to scream. She was overwhelmed, frustrated, and ready to quit. She could sense tears pricking at the edges of her eyes. That's when she caught sight of Dany, poised behind her, arms outstretched to steady her if she slipped. His expression was resolute but filled with compassion. "It's okay," he murmured, gently helping her regain her balance. "We'll try again tomorrow, and the day after that, and as many days as it takes." Those words, simple as they were, somehow gave Molly the resolve to keep pushing. Despite the ache in every joint, despite the fear that she might fail, she pushed forward. Because no matter how harsh the journey became, she wasn't making it alone. The real breakthrough came one sunny afternoon. Molly had grown tired of the sterile environment of the living room, where the furniture was often pushed aside to create space for her exercises. So Dany had helped her onto the back porch for a change of scene. The air was crisp, birdsong drifted through the yard, and golden rays of sunlight painted the patio floor. Despite the gentle warmth, Molly's muscles were clenched with tension. She'd been practicing standing with minimal support, but every attempt thus far had ended in wobbly uncertainty. With Dany positioned just a few feet away, she inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. "Take your time," he encouraged softly, his hands raised in caution, ready to catch her if she swayed. Molly set her crutches aside and braced herself against the railing. Her legs quivered, and for a panicked moment, she thought she might sink right back down. But she clung to the fragment of hope she'd carried since the surgery. Carefully, she let go of the railing, took one tentative step, then another. Her eyes flicked up to Dany, who was standing still, tears already welling in his eyes. He looked as though he was witnessing a miracle unfold right in front of him. A wave of adrenaline surged through Molly's body. She managed a third step, and by the time she reached him, she could hardly breathe. She almost collapsed into his arms. "Dad," she whispered, voice trembling. "I did it. I'm actually walking." Her father's shoulders shook, and he didn't bother hiding his tears. For one impossible moment, neither of them spoke. The sheer magnitude of that single step, repeated 3 times, felt more transformative than anything that had come before it. Her legs burned, her heart pounded, and every nerve in her body buzzed with exhaustion, but she'd done it. She had walked to her father on her own. They stood there, locked in an embrace that was part triumph and part relief. Molly sobbed quietly into his shoulder, releasing the fear and frustration she'd bottled up since the day she first learned she might never walk the way she dreamed. In those few steps, every barrier, every doubt, every old resentment she'd clung to faded away. All that remained was the undeniable bond of a father and daughter, forged through shared struggles and unwavering love. With each passing week, Molly's mobility improved. She still had hurdles to overcome. Physical therapy was an ongoing marathon, but her steps grew steadier, and the flicker of self-confidence she'd once lost began to shine again. School, which had been a minefield of insecurities, now felt more manageable. Some classmates even paused to congratulate her on her surgery, while others noted how the once quiet girl was standing a little taller, speaking a bit louder, and smiling more often. Then one Friday evening, a large envelope arrived in the mail. Molly stared at it, her name printed in bold type. Her heart fluttered as she recognized the return address, a university she'd applied to in hopes of landing a scholarship. Dany hovered behind her, his anticipation nearly tangible. She tore open the seal and read the letter inside, eyes scanning for the words that would decide her future. And there it was, glowing among the formalities and official language. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been awarded a full scholarship." Her breath caught, and tears immediately welled up. Dany gently rested a hand on her shoulder, concerned by her sudden gasp. But when she looked up, her face shone with joy. "Dad, I got it. I really got it," she managed, holding out the letter as proof. Without hesitation, Dany pulled her into a tight hug, elation surging through both of them. Every painful memory of hospitals, every tear shed in frustration, every moment of doubt was overshadowed by this brilliant affirmation of Molly's potential. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, voice quivering. "You have no idea how proud." Molly pressed her face into his shoulder, her tears soaking into the fabric of his shirt. She'd never felt so alive, so brimming with promise. As she clutched the acceptance letter, she couldn't help but remember the lonely girl she'd been months ago, afraid no one would ever see her, let alone believe in her. Yet here she was, standing on her own 2 feet, ready to step into a future where every dream felt suddenly attainable. "I'm proud to be your daughter," she said softly, gratitude filling her voice. Dany smiled, his eyes shining with the same grateful warmth. "And I'm proud to be your dad." In that moment, the journey they had taken, through grief, misunderstanding, tentative steps, and unexpected acts of generosity, culminated in one radiant truth. Love and determination could heal even the deepest wounds, paving the way for a brighter tomorrow.